So my name is Couillard, and I will be moderating today's webinar. Tony and I are thrilled that you have taken this moment to pause in your morning to join us for the Leadership Support webinar series. And we want to acknowledge your keen desire to nourish self in a time when leaders have been stretched really beyond capacity during COVID. Appreciating what HHS leaders have endured through the pandemic and with the stressors of ramping back up to service, we just want to remind folks that coaching support is available to all leaders. And if folks want to understand what a coaching conversation might look like or how we might be able to support you through some of the complexity and flux as you ramp back up to service, we're here to support you. And you can reach out to us at leadershipcoaching@hhsc.ca. Tony, if you could just flip the slide forward, please. I'd also like to flag that Dr. Frolick and Elizabeth Doughtry will be presenting on the ways that loss and grief impacts us as individuals and as a collective. I'd ask that if you're available and open on June 26th that you do join these folks for this webinar, because the more we can step into the space where we can talk about loss, grief, and gains and how we are really transforming during this time of COVID, we'll be better together and be able to have a healthier future. So do offer that to folks. And since Tony and I will be the only one on video this morning, I do invite you to take this hour just to relax, pause and reset, and just to be able to be present for this experience. In terms of next webinars, our next one will be on July the 9th at 10 a.m. with Kara Langdon and Brian Hirschuk. They will be exploring effective decision-making in times of uncertainty and ambiguity. And they will be discussing the quality framework and tools that can be used to make and evaluate decisions where accuracy may not be able to be possible, but instead really focusing on the quality of the decision-making process. So before I introduce Tony this morning, we'll just go over a few housekeeping things that we'd like to highlight. So the webinar will be approximately 50 minutes in length. If you want to ask questions, there is a Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and you can also use the chat box. I will be monitoring both throughout the webinar, and I will be able to pause periodically for Tony to respond to your questions. We really do invite you to participate. If you want, there are two options. So you can either message Tony and I by clicking all panelists, or if you want to extend a question or a comment out to the group, then you can select to all panelists and attendees. And if you know a colleague who might not be able to make it today, or you think someone else may enjoy this session after watching, all of our webinars are recorded and added to the Hamilton Health Sciences YouTube, which I've provided the link there for your reference. And I have also, I will also be sending these recorded webinars out through the Leadership Learning Bites, and you will receive those on June 25th. So now it's my pleasure to introduce our webinar speaker for today, my colleague, Tony, and friend. Tony is the Chief of Interprofessional Practice at HHS and holds a part-time assistant professorship in the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Neurosciences at McMaster University. Tony received a Bachelor of Science with honors from York University, a Master of Arts in Psychology with a concentration in Behavioral Neurosciences from Brock University, and a PhD in Clinical Developmental Psychology from York University. Tony is a clinical psychologist who practices with children, adolescents, and families with a particular interest in suicide prevention. In addition to his clinical background, Tony received a dual MBA from Queen's University and Cornell University, where he graduated with distinction. He is also the recipient of the Ontario Psychological Association's Dr. Ruth Berman Award for Leadership as an Early Career Psychologist, as well as the Interprofessional Education Award. Tony is particularly interested in the integration of clinical and business knowledge, value maximization, economics, business strategy, and ethics. So Tony, over to you.
Thanks so much, Ash, and thanks everybody for joining in. I feel very privileged and honored to be amongst such a stellar lineup of speakers. Jane Hasty in the last talk, Diana Tickets, Nicole Bendali, and of course the stellar lineup that continues on. Big shout out to Organizational Development for putting this series on. Very innovative, and I just feel grateful to be with you folks today. So I'm going to spend about an hour talking about all kinds of stuff, the sort of interface between psychology and business and existence, really, and functioning. So I want to start off by dedicating this talk to you folks, the viewer. Whether you are working on the front lines, whether you are working in our offices, making sure that folks are getting paid and that the lights are on and that the organization continues to function, thank you. For your sleepless nights, for your endless work days, thank you. I think as a community, we are coming together in an unprecedented way, and it really is a pleasure to be at least a part of such a strong team at Hamilton Health Sciences. So today what I'm going to hope to do is not bore you too much with the statistics, but I will sort of blend in a combination of storytelling as well as some empirical research, and I hope to provide some insight into personal growth, individual values, and how they interface with team dynamics. So we'll start with the I, and then we will move into the we. I've only been about 6 months into this role as one of the leaders here at HHS, so I've been doing a lot of reflecting. Reflecting on what it means to be a leader. What makes a leader a leader? So we'll start with the I, and then we'll move to the we. We'll start with two stories. Now, this is a story of two Bernards. So for bonus points, if anybody knows who this individual here on the left is in the suit and tie, put that in the Q&A box. You're a business grad within the last 10 years. I hope you do know, but I also hope in general that we know about the story of this Bernard. This Bernard actually passed away earlier this year from multiple health conditions, where he was released actually from a prison where he had served his last days. Does anybody know who this individual is? Well, he was once the darling of Wall Street. This is Bernard Ebbers, the former CEO of WorldCom. Now you might be asking yourself, well, what the heck is WorldCom? Well, long distance phone service, when people still made phone calls, was actually a very lucrative business. And it could be a lucrative business if you could cut costs. Now, Bernard Ebbers came from the motel industry, where he was a small business owner in Mississippi, and his values were really around cost containment and financial sustainability. He was a penny pincher, to the extent that he was able to actually maximize a lot of value for both his shareholders as well as his clients. So customers were able to get long distance services for a very inexpensive cost. Somewhere down the line, Bernie changed. And the group that he was with also helped reinforce this change. From the cost sustainable values that he had internalized, he moved into a world of conspicuous consumption. The same individual who removed the free coffee from the workspace for his employees started to buy yachts. Not only did he start buying yachts, he started to buy yacht building companies. He started to acquire his competition, where he was taking over other companies. And he strayed away from that financial stewardship. What ended up happening was he couldn't maintain his lifestyle, even though he was in 1999, wait for it, paid $935,000 a year and $27 million in stock options. It wasn't enough. And in fact, he had to then get a loan. Now, the thing is with stock options, you can't just sell them when you're the CEO, because when you sell a whole bunch of stock options, the people who own stock begin to panic because they have to wonder, why is the CEO selling all of this stock? So the board of directors actually gave him a $408 million loan. That caused some concern for the Securities and Exchange Commission, and lo and behold, he ends up several years later being charged and convicted of conspiracy and securities fraud and was sentenced to 25 years in federal prison. Where did it all go wrong? Where did the change happen? Was he willing to adapt to change, or was he stuck in a fixed way of being? Gentleman to the right, in the vest, if anybody knows who this person is, feel free to put it in the chat box. This is Bernard Hopkins. Bernard Hopkins right now is worth an estimated $40 million. He's a minority partner in the Golden Boy Boxing Promotion League. But he didn't start off that way. In fact, by the time he was 17, he was charged and convicted of 9 felonies and had an 18-year sentence where he was going to serve in Graterford Prison in Pennsylvania. And from there, he had to make a choice and he had to make a change. He determined to himself, based on his own words, that he no longer wanted to be an employee of the prison system. So what did he do? He took it upon himself to maximize every opportunity that he had and to really work along with his values and in alignment with his values. His values were discipline, were strength, and were physical fitness and perseverance. He went from a felon who was in a penitentiary to the penitentiary boxing champion. So actually in the state of Pennsylvania, they had a recreational program where they actually had sanctioned matches across Pennsylvania. Not only did he go on to win the middleweight championship in the Pennsylvania prison system, but he went on to have 20 title defenses, which is unheard of in combat sports. He was the undisputed middleweight champion for 20 title defenses, and he actually broke his own records of being the oldest champion to win a world championship, both at 48 years of age and at 49 years of age. What happened with Bernard? How did Bernard pivot? How did he adapt? How did he grow and move on from failure? What about the healthcare sector? Maybe we can talk about this a little bit more close to home. I'll start with a story about some of my own experiences working as a clinical psychologist. And this is a huge shout out to the whole child and youth mental health program at Hamilton Health Sciences. And in particular, our child and youth mental health unit over at our children's site. Now, these folks have to grapple with the concept of young people ending their lives by suicide every day. So they have to walk this fine dialectic between life and death, between acceptance and change. And every day, we're faced with these sorts of dilemmas in this type of work. So much so that sometimes we get caught up in the small things, or we get caught up in the tangibles because it's difficult for us to actually manage some of the more abstract things. And this is where the story of the spoon comes in. 2 very intelligent people, myself and Dr. Bode Akinton, the medical director of the unit, found ourselves at one point in time in a very challenging case, arguing and debating the type of spoon we should provide to a patient. Now you might ask yourself, well, maybe it has something to do with the nature of the spoon. Sometimes a spoon is just a spoon, and sometimes it's more than that. For me, this spoon represented so much more. It represented my own self-doubt. It represented my own fear and uncertainty. It represented the pressure of potentially having a young person die on our watch, and the magnitude and grief of the day-to-day traumas of working with folks who oftentimes are in extreme suffering. So how did we do this? Well, we had to learn and actually observe, create some distance to the fact that we were arguing about a spoon. Then we had to actually come together. And this is a team that functions from their child and youth workers and RNs all the way through to pharmacy, OT, social work, psychology, psychiatry, leadership across the board had to come together. Security came together, and we met every day in the pre-CQI era. Now we actually have functions and processes like CQI that force us together where we're actually generating solutions. And we met every single day to care plan and adapt to the changing circumstances at play so that we can best serve this individual. And through the grace and support of our ethics department, we were able to really enter into this dialectic. We called it the growth edge. The reality is, growth actually sometimes hurts. It actually is sometimes very challenging. We'd like to think that growth is linear, but oftentimes we find that it's not. And it was through our humility and our ability to take a step back that we found that more than just a spoon, it actually had a lot to do with ourselves. So, human beings, unfortunately, are very flawed, if you haven't figured that out already. Unfortunately for us, although we have big honking brains with a lot of cognitive skill, sometimes those things go awry. One example of this is the fundamental attribution error. Think about this. The last time you've gotten into a debate or an argument or a disagreement with somebody, how often have you found yourself maybe saying, there's something wrong with their personality, or there's something wrong with them, or there's an issue with them, as opposed to weighing situational variables. Maybe it was a bad day, or maybe there are other factors at play. Unfortunately, our brains sometimes bring us to this short-term type of thinking where we overestimate personal and individual differences and underestimate situational factors. And interestingly enough, think about it the opposite way in your life. When was the last time that maybe you didn't live according to your values, but you found yourself maybe rationalizing it by saying, yeah, but the situation dictated such and such, and maybe downplaying the importance of individual characteristics. Extremes are provocative, so they make for excellent social media posts. Unfortunately, they fail to synthesize the dialectic of human existence. And really, the middle path of acknowledging tensions between polarities is crucial. Mindfulness comes into play when we're talking about this, right? How do we actually observe the process of thought so that we can change our potential thoughts? So it's easy for others to, talk about, others being innately flawed, while those in the in-group are more virtuous and pure. This is a human characteristic. So let's pop up a poll here. Ash, I think we've got one coming up here. I want to know from you, fundamental attribution error, you find that it comes up in your role as a leader? And the results are coming in. So it looks like as the data is coming in, we're seeing that sometimes is the most frequently endorsed item, and often is the second most, 60 to 34% right now. And that makes good sense. Also, there are techniques, including that concept of mindfulness that we've been integrating through our systems here, helps with that ability to notice. Once we can notice, then we can make change. And our poll is closed. It's a breakdown of 60% sometimes, 34% often, and 5% rarely. And that makes good sense. To err is human. So what do we do about it? How do we grow? Well, if you folks aren't familiar with Carol Dweck, she's a psychologist at Stanford University and has spent the lion's share of her academic career studying and researching the concept of growth in human development, both working from a pediatric lens as well as working and looking at growth mindsets more generally. So the concept of a fixed mindset is really about, are you looking for validation of your ability as the primary importance? Perhaps the inner self-talk in your mind is, I need to avoid being found out as the imposter that I truly am. Maybe the self-talk in your mind is more negative than positive, but the concept that if I have to exert a certain amount of energy, or if I fail, am I a failure? A growth mindset takes that a little bit differently and looks at the concept of improvement of one's ability as important to human growth. This is the concept of sharpening of the sword, this idea of continuous growth, of continuous improvement, right? This actually aligns very well with the Shingo principles, aligns very well with how we see the humility of continuous growth and quality improvement. So take a moment to reflect. Reflect on that self-talk. How does it come up for you in your work? What are your values? Reflect on your values and reflect on whether or not your internal voice inspires you to live according to your values. Now let's look at a little bit of data. So here's some data from the National Bureau of Economic Research. This is a survey of, it started off with just shy of 2,000 surveys of chief executive officers and chief financial officers. Just a heads up, Rob McIsaac, please don't fire me. I need my job. I'm going to talk very well here. But jokes aside, really what we see here is that senior leaders value culture. They report valuing culture. It's an important part of value driving and value maximization. And folks talk about that if we improve culture, we can actually increase value. And this last point is very key, particularly in the financial world. NPV represents net present value. This concept is if I invest in a machine, if I invest in a company over the course of that time, if I go backwards in time to the present, net all of my costs, is it going to be profitable? That's a very important decision to make. Unfortunately, though, folks don't always necessarily make decisions based on that particular metric, and they report sometimes short-term thinking is around cultural issues. Also, executives talk about really having about 16% of executives believe that their own culture is where it needs to be. So we're seeing room for improvement in terms of culture change. Let's take it a step further. People have actually looked at the personality of CEOs and the profile of culture. Very important. When we talk about personality, there are 5 major domains of personality that are some of the most well-validated and robust findings in the psychological literature. We call the Big Five because it includes openness to experience, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. And all of us vary on these dimensions. It's not you're agreeable or you're not. These are continuous variables. And what they were actually able to do was they sampled, these were tech firms, and they actually sampled hundreds of people. And at first what they did was they got people to fill out a particular profile or questionnaire about what their organizational culture was like. And then you can do some very interesting statistics about that. So the profile itself had 54 items, and it used what's called a Q-sort methodology where you rank. But then what you can do with some fancy statistics is something called a principal components analysis. And what that really just means is, can I distill those 54 items actually into maybe a few items that best account for those things, what we call linear combinations of variables. And it accounts for the weighting of each of those variables. And there were 6 domains of culture: adaptability, integrity, collaborative, results-oriented, customer-oriented, and detail-oriented. What they also did was they had a subset of employees rate their CEO's personality on a particular metric that looked at, or measure that looked at, the Big Five. And what you find here, these are called beta weights. So this is about regression. So you can actually look at the unique variance or the unique accountability of these relationships. And what you find is level of conscientiousness of a CEO is, significantly predicts being detail-oriented. Openness to experience predicts adaptability, and we're going to talk about that. And not surprisingly, actually, especially in certain businesses, agreeableness was inversely related to results-oriented culture, meaning the less agreeable you were, the more results-oriented you were in your culture. We can talk more about that. Now, why this is important is because adaptability, when you then take adaptability and then look at the regressions between adaptability and a number of these metrics of business performance, well, guess what? Adaptability significantly predicted revenue growth, the valuation of the company, Fortune ratings, stock analyst recommendations, as well as employee ratings. So really robust findings about the importance of how our senior leaders approach change. And guess what? This is my time to plug the important move that we made as an organization. Last year, the year before, the organization had made, this was last year, 2019, the decision to take on what is called strategic debt. So not all debt is alike. This isn't operational debt. This is strategic debt. And what ended up happening was we took on this 200 million debenture. Well, how do we expect to actually buy new equipment? Our rate of funding is not in line with inflation already. As we know, the economy is struggling. Unemployment is at record highs. Because people aren't working, they're not spending and we're not producing, so GDP is expected to drop over time. The potential of inflation is a real issue for us, right? So we really don't want to be reliant on additional government funding. This is such a courageous and bold way for us to have some level of adaptability based on our own terms, in terms of what our patients and families need in the organization. So a fantastic way for us to think about what are we already doing in the organization that we can be proud of. Now, this is a bit of an anthropomorphized idea here. Organizations don't have minds. However, the collective group, as we know, we can talk about organizational mindset more generally. And we see this. I mean, reflect on your own experiences both here at HHS as well as elsewhere, and we'll find that in the fixed mindset organization, it doesn't really look like a great place to work. Where we're motivated to beat each other. We don't want to take risks. Maybe we get found out that we're imperfect and fallible. Maybe we don't share data or information together. And then you start seeing, when we look at the Bernard Ebbers case, that didn't happen overnight. The CFO was complicit and in fact helped change some of the expenses there. And what they did was they took something that was an operational expense and they tried to change it to a capital expense. That gobbledygook just basically means you've inflated your profits and it's illegal. That didn't happen overnight. It took time. And there was also a board of directors that monitored the CEO and the C-suite's performance. So this was a group, this is a group idea. You know, Bernard Ebbers went to prison, but he was part of a larger system, right? The growth mindset changes things for us. How do we take failure as actually an opportunity? How do we develop ourselves knowing that all of us will hopefully be better off after spending years working together than when we were when we first started working together? Because hopefully we would have learned from each other. So some important take-homes: fixed mindset, no surprise. Employees of workplaces like this tend to be less satisfied with their organizational culture. There tends to be less collaboration and trust, less innovation, and a greater desire for talent to seek opportunities elsewhere. So real implications when it comes to the health of our teams, as well as the bottom line in terms of maintaining a sustainable system. Also, when you think about growth mindset, again, think about what we already have in place. What is the concept of the A3? Why is it that we get curious? Why is it that we ask why so much? Why do we want to get into root causes? Why are we collecting data? And then why are we testing our assumptions and then retesting over time? It's about growth mindset. So, on for the next poll, Ash. My team has a growth mindset. Disagree, neutral, agree. Okay. So we see that the majority, 64%, agree. We've got about, we've got 23% that say are neutral, and we've got 13% that say disagree. So really what we're talking about here are opportunities for growth. We are human, remember. This is the fallibility aspect that we were talking about, where we are doing the best we can with the skills we have, and we must do better. This is the dialectic that we oftentimes present in the mental health world. So this isn't particularly surprising. This just, to me, shows that we have continuous growth and continuous improvement to do. So this is one of my favorite depictions of anxiety, The Scream by Edward Munch. Okay. So what are some of the factors or psychological mechanisms that might impact our ability to see the big picture and to work most collaboratively with each other? No surprise, you don't need a PhD for this. People like to talk about information that they already know about. And the majority likes to talk about information that they're already comfortable with, right? Familiar information gets the most airtime, regardless of whether or not it's accurate, regardless of whether or not it's comprehensive. But the concept of majority is an important one. It actually can be quite risky to play devil's advocate, to be the devil's advocate. In part because we know that cohesion feels good. We don't like to have debate necessarily that can get heated. We don't want bad blood. So in sometimes the pursuit of harmony, unfortunately, only common information ends up getting shared. One of the drivers of this is underlying desire for that information to align with our preferences. The other is the illusion of unanimity, of being unanimous. Unanimity is not always the case. In fact, we have diversity of opinion and diversity of thought that actually can really help with us checking our own blind spots, because the reality is we all have them. Again, the concept of collecting data, of testing our hypotheses in these sorts of experimental systems, that aligns very well with PDSA thinking, aligns very well with A3 thinking. How do we solve those problems? And most importantly, how do we solve those problems based on the data that we're getting from the people doing the work? These are oftentimes the front lines. And again, we see that this type of CQI thinking really leverages the front lines. If I asked in the poll, and I didn't create this poll, what is the first word or association that you have with the company Toyota? And I say both Toyota as well as their luxury brand Lexus. My thought is many of you would say reliability. There's a reason for that. The system that was created in a way to empower the worker, to empower the staff, to solve problems, and to be empowered to make change. And that's what we're really trying to do here at HHS as well, is to help inspire change of 15,000 problem solvers. Beware of groupthink. How is it that intelligent people, individuals, can sometimes come together and actually be so very wrong? Or how they can sometimes come together, maybe even argue about a spoon. If each of us is competent, then all of us together would be better, right? Maybe, sometimes. Beware of teams that are overly agreeable. Groupthink is a concept that was developed by Irving Janis in the early 80s, but really this idea that in the pursuit of this harmony, we actually sometimes really miss out on some important data that can have catastrophic effects. We've seen this happen in NASA with launches that have resulted in major fatalities. We've seen this in business. Certainly when we think about the WorldCom exemplar, again, we're talking about a board of directors who gave a $408 million bailout to an executive at a time where really what would have been helpful was an evaluation of what their entire system and business plan was. But again, there's risks in not fully agreeing. It might make us uncomfortable, and we might have to sit with that discomfort and talk through those sorts of things. There's 8 symptoms of groupthink. I won't go through all of them, but just be mindful. If we start to stereotype the other, and we start to look at the other as a stereotyped or as unworthy or inhuman, while ourselves are virtuous and invulnerable and highly moral, warning sign. If individuals in the group start censoring themselves for fear of retribution, it's a warning sign. If members of the group, sometimes directly or indirectly, appoint themselves or what is called mind guards, but this idea of actually pushing and pressuring people to succumb to that groupthink, that's a warning sign. And it happens, again, not necessarily all at once, but we start to see this potential slow movement where over time, next thing you know, you have this homogeneous thinking system that doesn't push the norms in any way. Be mindful of that. I mean, Roger Waters and David Gilmour from Pink Floyd said it best many years ago, so I don't have to repeat that. And this is actually, if you're interested in some great findings and some great teaching, Dr. Beta Elizabeth Mannix from Cornell University is a psychologist by trade, but is a fantastic instructor when it comes to managing and leading organizations.
Tony, I just see there's a comment in the chat. It says, good leaders lead well when they challenge others to examine issues and admit that they do not have all of the answers. Fear of failure in front of your team is a very powerful motivator and often results in taking the easy route through agreement.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And was there a question as well in there, Ash?
No, it was just a comment, but I thought it was a powerful comment.
It's a fantastic comment. I think that came from Dr. Seeley. And again, if you want to look at a fantastic leader, look to somebody like Dr. Seeley. When we think about, and physician leaders, as we see that the leadership role of physicians expands over time, and we see that there are multiple professions that work together in an interprofessional way, some of the best physician leaders have exactly that type of stance of moving from the all-knowing expert to the expert in one's specialized field, as well as how do you lead and motivate others to maximize their potential, and also sitting with the unknowns. Absolutely. There's another question as well in the box here, I think, Ash.
So once groupthink is identified, what is the first step for a resolution to change the mindset of the group?
Well, I don't know the scientific answer to that question as I'm fumbling with my screen here, but I would say that the first step that I think we can all take is the step of mindfulness. The idea of mindfulness is really about observing our thoughts, observing our current state, paying attention on purpose to the current moment without judgment. That stance allows, and that way of thinking allows for the psychological distance to start to create change. That psychological distance allows us to evaluate our assumptions. It allows us to evaluate our shortcomings. It also allows us to take the stance that we are all fallible. We're expecting fallibility, and in fact, being fallible is human and not a shot at our virtue, but in fact, it's a shared attribution or trait of humanity. So how do we then work together and create sort of the bridges as opposed to the divides? And I'm just noticing here, Ash, do I still have the open question box in the middle of the screen?
No, it's been exited. So there is another question, actually a few questions. So Denise Johnson asked, with one of the risks of groupthink being that individuals will censor themselves, how can we coach adversarial individuals to be free to speak their minds without hampering the process? The facilitation of respectful dialogue is so important.
Yeah. I think, again, there's probably a very expert opinion on this that has data to support it. I'm going to go back to the basics of communication and respectful communication. Just because you may be right when it comes to a particular set of facts, your delivery or your ability to connect with another human being may actually really impact your ability to get that message out. And in fact, for some folks, especially for those who are on whatever continuum of the agreeableness scale there, we have to be able to notice what is the emotion? What is the emotion that is coming through? What is the emotion that's attached to the words? What is my intent in terms of the motivation or the intent? Is the intent for team growth, individual and team growth, or is the intent to be right? So I think it's about framing intention. It's also about receiving helpful, constructive feedback that we can take with minimal defensiveness. Because when we receive that feedback, it's not about, again, ourselves or our virtue. It's about how do we continue to grow, knowing that we are in this together. Great question, Denise.
There's one more question and a comment. So how do you encourage leaders? Can you give suggestions on how to also give leaders constructive criticism?
It's a good question. And I don't know. I mean, there are certainly different platforms that we use in the organization, whether we're talking about crucial conversations. Somebody who would be an expert in that would be like Jane Hasty, who presented in our last session. But I think psychological mindedness is important. And I will be talking a little bit more as we move forward. Emotional intelligence is important. And we've sort of, that term is diluted and has many different connotations. But if we can get to the emotions that impact us and the emotions that bring out the best in us, as well as potentially not the best in us, these are important strategies. And I will say, we have such a wealth of creativity in this organization. This is my time to plug actually a few of our folks. Again, the Child and Youth Mental Health Program, they are developing a whole system and they are working with experts in the field around emotions to develop that intelligence around, in this case, it's around connecting with other human beings in a clinical capacity. But how do we potentially take that thinking and say, how do we better connect with each other as human beings, right, within the organization, leader or otherwise? So I would certainly give major kudos to our Child and Youth Mental Health Group, but also our West Lincoln Mental Health Group, experts in a number of different therapies, but again, in communication, in interpersonal effectiveness, in balancing assertiveness with a sense of playfulness and harmony. Our group at the West Lincoln Mental Health Team would offer some amazing insights in that area. And they're in-house. So we have these in-house experts that could potentially add some real value in ways that we haven't necessarily thought about in the past. Okay.
Sure, that's great, Tony. So there's just a couple comments, so I'll just read those out.
Sure.
Kirsten Zale says, I think it's really powerful when leaders are also open themselves to feedback. Sometimes there's a belief that inherent in the position of a leader that you've mastered all of the requisite work required of a leader.
Absolutely, Kirsten.
Yeah, and then Dr. Khan says, I find the jump to solutions problem is often where groupthink takes off. Stopping and assessing root cause analysis and pros and cons of possible strategies allows for the diversity of options and opinions to flourish and reduce the groupthink.
Fantastic. And as this is evolving, this conversation, it actually does make a lot more sense that you folks, I think there's over 100 people in this group talk around offering these sorts of suggestions. This is fantastic because we're all coming from different areas and we can really add to our collective intelligence. So it's absolutely fantastic. So are there more comments in there as well, Ash?
Just a comment from Dr. Seeley. I love the point on leveraging intelligence.
Totally. And Dr. Khan, I totally resonate with what you're saying. And this is, again, where that Shingo thinking comes from. If you want to learn about humility, learn about the life of Shigeo Shingo and about the Shingo principles, this is about coming in with absolute humility and gathering data. Gathering data, and again, you mentioned the term root cause analysis, getting into sort of what is the root. When we ask why, we can potentially get a greater sense of meaning, especially as we continue to ask why. And it helps us sort of free ourselves from certain assumptions. It also, to I think other folks' points as well, it allows us for us to get intel and data from the people doing a lot of the work, knowing that absolutely, I think Kirsten had mentioned this, we don't have all the answers. And at least I can tell you, I certainly don't. And my first 6 months on this job has been a big slice of humble pie. We don't have the answers. As a community, we still might not have the answers. However, maybe we can get closer and closer together. So some strategies. Notice, notice, notice. This is the fundamental of mindfulness. This is the fundamental of what we talk about in our pause, reset, and nourish framework in the organization, where we start with the notice. Before you can do anything about what's happening in your body and in your mind, you have to be able to observe it first. Whether they're your judgments, your biases, what happens in your body. You know, before you lose your temper, do you sweat more? Do you feel the tension in your shoulders? Notice, know what your signals are. And then this concept of getting curious, that actually the pursuit of knowledge is a shared one together. That I think everybody's point in the group, we can't do this alone. And leaders can't do this alone. And leaders only function in as much as they have a team that they're going to be able to help lead, and that leaders will develop within the team themselves. Be aware and beware of things that create power plays. Encourage creativity and generation. So the premature voting, be very mindful of voting immediately in a meeting or early on in a meeting, because you may get the illusion of a unanimous consensus that very well may not be the case. How do you embrace the diversity of perspective and to create true psychological safety? This is challenging because sometimes the rights and the safety of one person may conflict where, again, tensions create on the other side with maybe another person. So how do we come together? Remaining curious is going to be key to this. And mindfulness, I think, really helps underlie that curiosity. And then how do we leverage the team? The team will have a story. We are only one member of that team as leaders. We need to hear the team story. Okay. So how do we link work to deeper meaning? Let's go back to your values. Go back to what are the things that you stand for? What are the things that matter to you? What are your values? And then the next step is also noticing that your values can be in tension. They can be in conflict with each other. On the Child and Youth Mental Health Unit, they have to manage the tension of human autonomy on one end and safety on the other. This idea of acceptance on one end and change in the other. These are potential tensions that we really actually get even more data when we start to synthesize those tensions, but they're hard in terms of lived experience. And then it's about what brings your team the greatest sense of meaning and purpose. We're quite fortunate. We work in healthcare. There is what is known as the hero narrative in healthcare. We all want to be heroes. Whether we wear a suit and tie or whether we're wearing scrubs, we want to be part of the team that helps. The term patient comes from the term one who suffers. We want to be a part of the alleviation of the suffering. We want to be good. We want to do good. The concept of beneficence. That gives us a whole heck of a lot of meaning, and it's something that we can really leverage as a group. We also talked about creating genuine psychological safety, and we also talked about mastering the science of emotions. And again, I just gave a shout out to Child and Youth Mental Health and West Lincoln Mental Health. The reality is we've got in-house experts probably across this organization, so I don't want to miss out on anybody, but there are lots of folks who really have a good understanding of emotions that can be intrinsic leaders. The beauty is we also have this really amazing framework that some folks may have seen and some folks may not have. So this is what I call the house that Dr. Andrea Frolick and ethics team has built. But really, this is a way or a framework, and you can integrate this with other ethics frameworks, either from your regulatory colleges or from other sources of ethics materials. But really, the idea and the base of this house is about identifying your gut reaction. What's the urge? What's the initial judgment? What are the initial experiences involved? That's the base. Then it moves into studying facts from a holistic, comprehensive lens. Then it gets you to break down options within the context of your values and duties. And then it gets you to justify those options and sustain them. By the way, so this was built pre-CQI. It looks very, very similar to deep thinking. So how do we go from reflexive to reflective thinking? This is very similar to an A3 type of process. It requires mindfulness. It requires us to be able to see when we're studying facts from multiple vantage points, from multiple stakeholders. And it forces us to potentially review and continue on in this iterative process. So we know that ethical decision-making isn't linear, and we know that oftentimes our clinical decision-making isn't necessarily linear. So it provides this important framework, and we'll be including this, and it is also posted on our hub as well. We have the organizational ethics version as well as the clinical ethics version as you are working through ethical issues. And again, just to plug, it doesn't replace our ethics service. We have ethics consultants in-house who also can help you work through some of those tricky issues. Our ethics team has gone a step further to say, okay, we already have this incredible tool, this framework, but what about within the context of a pandemic? So we do have this pandemic focused issues tool, which looks very similar in nature, but it also talks about some very specific principles during the pandemic. We know that we need to be grounded in our values now more than ever. And these principles, I think, really help guide making some very difficult decisions that folks across the organization may potentially have to make. So the hour's gone by pretty quickly. I love talking about these things. So, I mean, should conversations come up, or if you'd ever like to reach out, I'm more than happy to continue with these types of growth conversations. And I'll leave you with this concept of resilience that I'm learning actually as I go through this process myself, dealing with my own sorrow, my own emotion, my own grief, my own anxiety. Dr. Frolich said this best, that even though resilience is a noun, it really actually is more of an action or a doing word, like a verb. Resilience is a practice. It's a lifestyle. It's about continuous growth. It's about adaptation. So I wish you the absolute best in your journey of growth and adaptation, and love to have more questions before we end today.
Thank you so much, Tony. So we do have a question. Are you aware about academic bullying or harassment? It permeates all academic institutions. How is HHS dealing with this serious problem in academic institutions?
So I'm not aware of the actual literature on academic bullying, although I'm certain there is a literature, so it's not an area of expertise of mine, but I can certainly see that. In my own lived experience going through academia and also continuing to be in an academic health science organization, bullying does exist. I will say we do have certain mechanisms in place around bullying. We have our values-based code of conduct. I think we still have a lot more growth to go, because bullying can look very different. I mean, as a leader, leaders have to be prepared to expect vertical bullying. That actually, you may be in a position of relative power as a result of your leadership status, but you may be in a precarious position of not having the same number of allies. So you may be in a situation where a group of people vertically bully upward. It's a serious problem. I think we need to come together as a group that needs to include human rights and inclusion. It needs to include ethics. I think it needs to include a group of stakeholders that can come together to manage and to move forward, to acknowledge the issues, again, that mindfulness, and then for us to create sustainable change. So I don't have the answer to that specific question. I could appreciate that it's certainly an issue, and I think we need to continue to work on how do we communicate and be kinder to each other.
Thanks, Tony. There's another question. Why do you think mindfulness is so important for leaders?
Yeah, I think mindfulness is core to our humanity. By the way, this isn't a new concept. The mindfulness literature comes from Eastern philosophy and Zen Buddhism, and has been a part of human existence for a very long time. In the Western world now, we've adapted it in a number of different ways, including integrating it in psychotherapies. Mindfulness is about living with your eyes wide open. Many times we may be with our eyes open, but not really awake. We may not be truly aware or present. Mindfulness creates that presence. It allows us to manage our own emotional state, to synthesize the rational parts of our mind and the emotional parts of our mind, and to synthesize those things together to bring about wisdom. I think it's a powerful set of techniques and practices in existence and in life to alleviate human suffering. As leaders, we can be important role models to model what it is to be mindful, model what it is to be fallible, and to create that collective connection between others and community. So I think leaders have a really important role, and mindfulness can help.
So there's another question, actually two. Can you quickly comment on the pitfalls that are present when seeking or relying upon consensus, something that we often do when looking to establish fact?
Yeah, consensus can be a real issue especially when your group is homogenous, when you don't have voices of those who may not be at the table and represented. So the majority rule may only work for the majority, but it may not work for the folks that, for other folks, and potentially for the folks that need it the most. And just because a bunch of people believe something doesn't necessarily make it true. And how you might then unpack the concept of truth, by that I mean things like objective markers or measurements, and things where even in those objective markers, there will be ranges of error, there will be ranges of estimation. So one of the real issues with homogenous groups is when you don't have that diversity of stakeholders at the table and different voices, those voices might not be heard. So it's a major issue, and it's an issue around how we conceptualize equity and inclusion.
Thanks, Tony. So there is a comment from Dr. Seeley. So years ago, physicians were trained by academic bullying. This led to doctors always feeling they had to be right, have the right answer when confronted by teachers, supervisors, etc. Hence the reason why a lot of older physicians like me find it difficult to remain open to opposing ideas or admit when we do not have all the right answers. Emotional intelligence is key around this issue. Thanks, Tony, for a great webinar. So it's a comment. There is another question in the Q&A. So any suggestions in terms of supporting those who thought guard bound by a sense of ideology and self-determined vision?
I think one of the major issues that we're facing in humanity right now, and we're trying the best we can right now, even with Zoom, is the concept of connectedness. You know, we talk about social distancing, and now we're trying to change that to physical distancing. There is a bit of distance that's created, and we see this very poignantly in the social media world. My goodness, it's the land of polarities. It's about connecting with other human beings. How do we see the kernel of truth in that person's stance? How do we see their reality? How do we try not to judge that? And how do we then come to consensus, or rather, not consensus, synthesis of those opposing viewpoints? Some of the fundamentals of that is sitting down and having a conversation. Maybe a physically distanced conversation, but connecting with people. Noticing what that does for you too, because remember, part of the dynamic isn't just what is said or what is done, but is how it impacts oneself. So noticing one's own emotions, as well as trying to connect with the emotions and the experience of others. I think more than ever in society, we need to be having deep conversations that are based on trust, integrity, dignity, and peace.
Thanks, Tony. So I do see there is another question, but from timing, we won't be able to get to it. But anyone who does have questions, feel free to email those to leadershipcoaching@hhsc.ca, and Tony will be able to respond back to those. I just want to say thank you so much, Tony, for such an insightful webinar on team performance, highlighting the importance of cohesion, creating space for dialogue, and really highlighting the importance of creating a culture that is psychologically safe so people are able to voice their narratives, concerns, and so forth. So thank you again. You've offered us many tangible tools to avoid pitfalls and optimize team performance. So thank you, thank you. For everyone, just stay tuned for the Leadership Learning Bites on June 25th for additional leadership tools and tips from this webinar. We'll be able to provide some frameworks that will help assist in getting out of some of that groupthink. I look forward to seeing everyone at the next webinar on July 9th. Same time, same place. Take care, everyone. Thank you for your engagement.